The Arizona Territory, 1887, a time when the West was still carved by violence and hope in equal measure, where a woman's survival often depended on the strength of the man she chose to trust. For most ladies traveling west to marry strangers, the greatest fear was incompatibility or loneliness. But what happens when the gentle rancher who promised you a peaceful life turns out to be one of the most wanted criminals in 3 territories? This is the story of Catherine Walsh, a schoolteacher from Vermont whose carefully planned escape from poverty led her straight into the arms of danger, until a half Comanche sheriff with his own complicated past offered her something she never expected to find in the lawless frontier: true sanctuary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Catherine Walsh pressed her face against the train window as the Vermont countryside blurred past, each mile carrying her further from the only life she had ever known. The letter in her reticule, read so many times the creases had worn soft, promised a new beginning in Copper Falls, Arizona Territory. Thomas Brennan had written with such eloquence about his cattle ranch, his desire for an educated wife to bring refinement to his frontier home, and his commitment to providing security for the right woman. At 24, Catherine had watched her younger sisters marry while she remained trapped in her father's house, teaching reluctant children for wages that barely covered her keep. The schoolmaster position in Millbrook had ended when the town council decided they preferred a man for the role, leaving Catherine facing the grim prospect of spinsterhood in a community that had already labeled her too independent for her own good. The death of her parents in a carriage accident the previous winter had sealed her fate. With no inheritance except debts and a small trunk of belongings, Catherine had responded to Thomas Brennan's advertisement with the desperation of a woman who understood that marriage, even to a stranger, offered her only path to survival. His letters had been everything she could have hoped for: respectful, intelligent, and bearing the promise of a partnership rather than mere servitude. He had even agreed to her unusual request that they correspond for 6 months before her journey west, allowing her to save money for travel and gather the courage for such a momentous decision. Now, as the train carried her through unfamiliar landscapes toward a future she couldn't entirely envision, Catherine reviewed everything she knew about her intended husband. Thomas Brennan, 32 years old, owner of the Double Creek Ranch outside Copper Falls. He had inherited the property from his uncle and built it into a prosperous operation specializing in breeding horses for the Army. His letters spoke of a comfortable home, reliable income, and his desire for children to carry on his legacy. Most importantly, he had assured her that he valued education and looked forward to her influence in bringing books and learning to their isolated community. Catherine had packed carefully for this journey, bringing her most treasured possessions: her father's collected works of Shakespeare, a worn Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, the silver locket that held her parents' photographs, and enough practical clothing to see her through her first months as a rancher's wife. She had also brought her teaching materials, hoping that Copper Falls might eventually need a school where she could share her love of learning with frontier children. The prospect of combining marriage with meaningful work had made Thomas Brennan's proposal irresistible. As the train pulled into stations across the expanding nation, Catherine observed her fellow passengers with growing fascination. Families heading west with everything they owned piled into wagons, prospectors clutching mining equipment and dreams of silver strikes, and other women like herself traveling alone toward uncertain futures. At a stop in Kansas, she struck up a conversation with Mrs. Helena Morrison, a widow returning to her son's ranch in Colorado after visiting relatives back east. "You've got the look of a mail-order bride about you, dear," Mrs. Morrison observed with the bluntness that seemed common among frontier women. "That careful way of holding yourself, like you're practicing for a part you're not sure you can play." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks but didn't deny the assessment. I'm traveling to Arizona Territory to marry a rancher I've been corresponding with. Is it so obvious? Mrs. Morrison's laugh held no mockery, only understanding. I did the same thing 30 years ago when my first husband died back in Ohio. Best decision I ever made, though I won't lie and say it was easy. The frontier changes a person, usually for the better if you let it. The men out here value strength more than delicacy, and a woman who can think for herself is worth her weight in gold. The conversation continued for hours as the landscape outside grew increasingly rugged and unfamiliar. Mrs. Morrison shared stories of frontier life that both excited and intimidated Catherine, women who had defended their homes against Indian raids, who had delivered babies in blizzards, who had built businesses and raised children in conditions that would have defeated their eastern counterparts. By the time they parted ways in Denver, Catherine felt she had glimpsed the possibility of a life far more adventurous than anything Vermont had offered. The final leg of her journey took her south through Colorado and into New Mexico territory. Before turning west toward Arizona, the mountains gave way to high desert, a landscape so alien to her Vermont experience that it might have been another planet. Red rock formations thrust from the earth like ancient monuments, and the sky stretched endlessly blue above terrain that seemed to shimmer with heat even in early autumn. This was the land that would become her home, assuming all went well with Thomas Brennan. At a stop in Flagstaff, Catherine purchased a wide-brimmed hat and lighter clothing from a general store, following the advice of a fellow passenger who warned her about the intensity of southwestern sun. The storekeeper's wife, a weathered woman with kind eyes, looked her over appraisingly. "You're not dressed for ranch life, honey," she observed, taking in Catherine's traveling dress with its fitted bodice and full skirts. "You'll want split skirts or riding pants if you're planning to help with any outdoor work. And boots, proper boots that can handle rough ground and horse barns." Catherine hesitated, uncertain whether Thomas would approve of such unconventional attire. Her correspondence with him had focused on intellectual matters rather than practical details of daily life. "My intended husband owns a cattle ranch. Do you think he would expect me to participate in ranch work?" The woman's expression grew skeptical. "If he's planning to keep you locked in the house like some kind of parlor decoration, he picked the wrong territory. Out here, everyone works or everyone suffers. A good ranch wife needs to know one end of a horse from the other and be able to handle herself when her husband's away on business." This perspective differed dramatically from Thomas's letters, which had emphasized his desire to protect her from the harsh realities of frontier life. He had written of hiring sufficient help to spare her from manual labor, of creating a refined atmosphere where she could pursue her interests in literature and education. Perhaps the storekeeper's wife was simply projecting her own experience onto Catherine's situation. After all, Thomas had specifically sought an educated wife rather than a frontier workhorse. Still, Catherine purchased a split skirt and practical boots along with her other supplies. Reasoning that versatility couldn't hurt, she also bought a small Derringer pistol after the storekeeper insisted that any woman traveling alone in the territory needed protection. Catherine had never held a firearm in her life, but the weight of the weapon in her reticule provided an odd sort of comfort as the train carried her deeper into unfamiliar country. The closer she got to Copper Falls, the more Catherine found herself alternating between excitement and terror. What if Thomas found her lacking in person after their months of correspondence? What if she couldn't adapt to the isolation and harsh conditions of ranch life? What if their intellectual compatibility didn't translate into personal harmony? She had committed everything to this venture. There was no money for a return journey to Vermont. Even if she wanted to retreat, her trunk contained letters from 3 school teachers who had promised recommendations should she wish to seek employment in Arizona Territory. But Catherine had been honest enough with herself to recognize that teaching positions for women were scarce everywhere, and she had no connections in the Southwest to help her secure such work. Marriage to Thomas Brennan represented not just her best option, but her only realistic path to security and independence. As the train approached Copper Falls on a crisp October morning, Catherine performed a final inventory of her appearance. In the small mirror she kept in her traveling case, her auburn hair, though somewhat disheveled from days of travel, remained neatly pinned beneath her hat. Her green eyes showed the strain of the journey, but also a determination that had carried her through the loss of her parents and the collapse of her former life. She had grown thinner during her months of saving money for this trip, but she remained presentable enough to make a good first impression. The train whistle announced their arrival with a sound that seemed to echo off the desert mountains surrounding the small frontier town. Catherine gathered her belongings with hands that trembled slightly, checking once more that Thomas's final letter was secure in her reticule. He had promised to meet her at the station, and his last correspondence had expressed genuine eagerness for her arrival and their immediate marriage. The local preacher had been contacted, arrangements made for a small ceremony followed by the journey to his ranch where they would begin their life together. Through the window, Catherine could see Copper Falls taking shape, a collection of wooden buildings scattered along a single main street, with the promise of mountains and endless sky beyond. Somewhere in this rugged landscape was the man who would become her husband, the ranch that would become her home, and the future she had traveled 2,000 miles to claim. As the train shuddered to a halt and other passengers began gathering their possessions, Catherine Walsh took a deep breath and prepared to step into the life she had chosen, trusting that her carefully laid plans would prove sufficient for whatever challenges lay ahead. The platform bustled with activity as passengers disembarked and freight was unloaded. Catherine scanned the small crowd for a man matching Thomas's description: tall, dark-haired, wearing a brown leather vest according to his letter. Several men waited near the station, but none approached her with recognition. She retrieved her trunk from the baggage car and stood uncertainly beside it, clutching her reticule and looking for someone who might be her intended husband. A young man in his early 20s approached, removing his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, would you be Miss Catherine Walsh from Vermont?" Catherine's heart sank slightly. This boy could hardly be Thomas Brennan, who had described himself as a mature man with established property. "Yes, I am." "Are you here on behalf of Mr. Brennan?" The young man's expression grew uncomfortable. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Billy Harrison, one of Mr. Brennan's hands. He sent me to collect you and bring you out to the ranch. He said to apologize for not coming himself, but urgent business kept him from town today." Catherine felt the first stirring of unease. In his letters, Thomas had emphasized how eagerly he awaited her arrival and his intention to personally welcome her to Arizona territory. What business could be so urgent as to prevent him from meeting his bride-to-be after months of correspondence and weeks of travel? "I see," she managed, trying to hide her disappointment. "And how far is the ranch from town?" "About an hour's ride, ma'am. I've got a wagon waiting." Billy gestured toward a dusty vehicle hitched to two tired-looking horses. "Mr. Brennan said to tell you he's real sorry about this and looks forward to making it up to you once you're settled." As Billy loaded her trunk into the wagon bed, Catherine noticed several townspeople watching their interaction with expressions she couldn't quite interpret. A few women whispered among themselves, their glances alternating between sympathy and something that might have been warning. An older man in a sheriff's badge observed from the porch of what appeared to be the jail, his dark eyes following Billy's movements with obvious suspicion. Catherine climbed onto the wagon seat beside Billy, who seemed increasingly nervous as they prepared to leave town. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, hoping conversation might settle her growing anxiety. "Mr. Brennan writes that it's quite prosperous." Billy's hands tightened on the reins. "Oh yes, ma'am. Real prosperous. Mr. Brennan's got fine horses and plenty of business ventures. Keeps him busy, that's for sure." Something in his tone suggested meanings beyond his words. But before Catherine could pursue the matter, they were rolling out of Copper Falls onto a dusty road that wound through increasingly desolate country. Behind them, Catherine caught a final glimpse of the town and the sheriff, who continued to watch their departure with what looked very much like concern. The wagon jolted over increasingly rough terrain as they left Copper Falls behind, the road deteriorating into little more than twin ruts carved by previous travelers. Catherine gripped the wooden seat to steady herself, her traveling dress collecting dust despite her efforts to shake it off. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, red rock mesas, scattered Joshua trees, and mountains that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon heat like mirages. Billy Harrison remained unusually quiet for the first mile, his attention focused on navigating the roughest patches of road, while stealing occasional glances at Catherine as if trying to gauge her reaction to their surroundings. Finally, he cleared his throat awkwardly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what exactly did Mr. Brennan tell you about his operations here in the territory? Catherine sensed an undercurrent to his question that made her increasingly uncomfortable. He wrote extensively about his cattle ranch and horse breeding program. He mentioned contracts with the Army and plans to expand his holdings. Why do you ask? Billy's jaw worked silently for a moment before he responded. Well, ma'am, it's just that ... Mr. Brennan's business interests are pretty wide-ranging. Sometimes folks in town don't understand all the ins and outs of what he does. There can be misunderstandings. The evasive nature of his answer did nothing to settle Catherine's growing unease. What sort of misunderstandings? Oh, you know how small towns can be. People talk, spread rumors. Mr. Brennan says it's just jealousy because he's more successful than most. He's got connections throughout the territory that other ranchers don't have. As they crested a small rise, Catherine caught her first glimpse of what Billy claimed was the Double Creek Ranch. The main house sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by several outbuildings and corrals that seemed well maintained. Horses grazed in nearby pastures, and she could see men moving about their business near the barns. At first glance, it appeared exactly as Thomas had described, a prosperous operation with all the signs of success. But as they drew closer, Catherine began noticing details that didn't align with her expectations. The men working around the property were heavily armed, wearing gun belts and carrying rifles as if expecting trouble. Guard posts had been established at strategic points around the ranch, manned by individuals who seemed more focused on watching the surrounding countryside than tending livestock. Most unsettling of all, several of the horses in the corrals bore brands that appeared to have been altered, fresh marks, burned over older ones in a pattern Catherine had heard described as the work of horse thieves. Billy, she said carefully, why are all the men armed? Mr. Brennan never mentioned any trouble with Indians or bandits in this area. Billy's face flushed red beneath his hat brim. Oh, that's just ... Well, ma'am, the territory can be dangerous. Apaches sometimes raid through here, and there's always the threat of Mexican banditos coming up from below the border. Mr. Brennan just believes in being prepared. Catherine had read enough about Arizona territory to know that Apache raids were indeed a concern, but something about Billy's explanation felt rehearsed. The way the guards positioned themselves suggested they were more worried about pursuit from the direction of town than attacks from hostile Indians. As their wagon approached the main house, a man emerged from the front door and strode toward them with confident authority. Catherine's first thought was that Thomas Brennan was considerably more handsome than his letters had led her to expect, tall and lean with dark hair and penetrating blue eyes, dressed in well-tailored clothes that spoke of prosperity. But there was something hard about his expression, a calculating quality in his gaze as it swept over her that made Catherine instinctively straighten her shoulders. Miss Walsh, he said, reaching up to help her down from the wagon with practiced gallantry. "Welcome to the Double Creek Ranch. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous?" "Mr. Brennan," Catherine replied, accepting his assistance while studying his face for some sign of the warmth his letters had conveyed. "The journey was long but manageable. I was disappointed you couldn't meet me in town, though I understand. You had pressing business." Something flickered across his features, annoyance, perhaps, or calculation. "Yes, unfortunately, I had to deal with some complications regarding a horse shipment. These things can't be delayed when you're dealing with government contracts." Catherine nodded, though she noticed he didn't meet her eyes when discussing his business. "Of course. I'm looking forward to learning more about your operations here." Thomas's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure you are. But first, let's get you settled. Mrs. Garcia will show you to your room so you can refresh yourself before dinner. We can discuss our arrangements then." An older Mexican woman appeared. As if summoned, her dark eyes kind but cautious as she approached Catherine with a respectful nod. "Señora, if you would follow me, please. I have prepared the guest room for you." As Mrs. Garcia led her toward the house, Catherine heard Thomas speaking in low tones to Billy behind them. She couldn't make out the words, but the urgency in his voice contradicted his casual demeanor moments before. Inside the house, she was struck by the quality of the furnishings, expensive furniture that seemed out of place in a frontier ranch house. Paintings and decorative items that suggested wealth far beyond what legitimate cattle ranching typically provided. The guest room was comfortable and well appointed, with a view of the corrals and mountains beyond. Mrs. Garcia helped her unpack, while maintaining a careful silence that Catherine found increasingly troubling. Finally, as the woman prepared to leave, Catherine gathered her courage. "Mrs. Garcia, may I ask how long you've worked for Mr. Brennan?" The older woman paused at the door, her hand on the knob. "2 years, Señora. Since my husband was killed." "I'm sorry for your loss. Was it an accident?" Mrs. Garcia's expression grew guarded. "He worked for Mr. Brennan. Sometimes that can be dangerous work." Before Catherine could ask what she meant, Mrs. Garcia slipped out of the room, leaving her alone with mounting questions about the man she had traveled across the country to marry. Catherine moved to the window and observed the activity in the ranch yard below. The armed guards, the altered brands on the horses, the expensive furnishings, and now hints of dangerous work that had cost a man his life. Nothing about this situation matched Thomas Brennan's carefully crafted letters. Dinner that evening was served in a dining room that reinforced Catherine's suspicions about the source of Thomas's wealth. Crystal glasses, silver place settings, and a mahogany table that must have cost more than most ranchers earned in a year created an atmosphere of luxury that seemed forced rather than natural. Thomas had changed into evening clothes that would have been appropriate in a Boston drawing room, but appeared almost theatrical in this frontier setting. "I hope you find everything to your satisfaction," he said, pouring wine from a bottle bearing a French label. "I've spared no expense in creating a civilized environment here." Catherine accepted the wine but barely touched it, her appetite diminished by growing anxiety. "It's all very impressive. Your letters mentioned that you inherited this ranch from your uncle. He must have been quite successful to establish such luxury in the wilderness." Thomas's hand paused fractionally as he served himself from a platter of beef. Uncle Jeremiah was resourceful. He understood that success in the territory requires flexibility and vision beyond conventional ranching. What sort of vision? Well, for instance, he recognized early that the Army's need for quality horses would create opportunities for those willing to travel throughout the territory acquiring suitable stock. Government contracts are lucrative, but require suppliers who can deliver large numbers of animals quickly. Catherine sensed layers of meaning beneath his explanation. That must require extensive travel to locate enough horses. "Do you personally handle these acquisitions?" Thomas's smile grew strained. I have reliable associates who assist with procurement. It's dangerous work, as Mrs. Garcia might have mentioned. Men who venture too far from established settlements sometimes encounter difficulties. The way he spoke about Mrs. Garcia suggested he knew exactly what the housekeeper had told Catherine earlier. The realization that her conversations were being monitored or reported added another layer of unease to an already troubling situation. Mr. Brennan Thomas, I hope you won't think me forward, but I feel I should mention that some aspects of your operation here differ from what your letters led me to expect. His eyes sharpened with what looked like genuine interest. In what way? Catherine chose her words carefully. Your correspondence emphasized the peaceful nature of ranch life and your desire to create a haven of civilization in the wilderness. Yet I notice your men are heavily armed and seem more like guards than cowboys. It suggests a level of danger or conflict you never mentioned. Thomas set down his fork and studied her with a directness that made Catherine suddenly aware of her. Isolation. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Town was an hour's ride through empty country, and she was completely dependent on this man's goodwill. Catherine, he said finally, I may call you Catherine now that you're here? You strike me as an intelligent woman, so I'll be frank with you. The frontier is not the civilized environment you're accustomed to back east. Success here requires a certain adaptability in one's methods. The law in Arizona Territory is often absent or ineffective, which means a man must be prepared to protect himself and his interests through whatever means necessary. Are you saying you operate outside the law? Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. I'm saying the law out here is whatever a man can enforce. The territorial government is hundreds of miles away, and local sheriffs are often corrupt or incompetent. A successful businessman creates his own rules and defends them. Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. Thomas, what exactly is your business? Your real business, not the stories about cattle ranching and horse breeding. His facade dropped entirely, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. My business, my dear Catherine, is providing services that the good citizens of Arizona Territory need, but prefer not to acknowledge. I acquire horses for the Army through the most efficient means available. One, provide protection for merchants traveling dangerous routes. I offer loans to desperate men when banks won't extend credit. I solve problems that can't be addressed through conventional channels. Catherine's hands trembled as she set down her wine glass. You're describing criminal activities. Horse theft, extortion, illegal lending. I'm describing survival and success in an environment where conventional morality is a luxury most can't afford. Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her reaction with detached interest. Your letters suggested you were a practical woman seeking security rather than romance. I offer both security and prosperity beyond anything a simple schoolteacher could expect. All I require in return is a wife who can appreciate discretion and loyalty. Catherine felt trapped between disbelief and growing horror as the implications of his words sank in. You want me to become an accomplice to your criminal enterprises. I want you to become my wife and the mistress of this ranch. What you choose to know or ignore about my business methods is entirely up to you. Many successful frontier wives have learned that ignorance can be a form of wisdom. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the ranch at high speed. Thomas immediately tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun belt he had removed for dinner. Through the dining room window, Catherine could see several riders galloping into the ranch yard, their horses lathered with sweat and dust. Billy Harrison burst through the front door without ceremony, his face flushed with excitement and alarm. Mr. Brennan, we've got trouble. Sheriff's posse from Tucson is maybe 2 hours behind us. They tracked us from Morrison Place. Thomas rose from his chair with fluid grace. his entire demeanor transforming from dinner host to military commander. How many men? What do they know? Maybe 8 or 10 riders, led by that half-breed sheriff from Copper Falls. Word is they found Morrison's body and evidence linking our boys to the bank job. They're carrying federal warrants. Catherine watched this exchange with growing horror as the reality of her situation crystallized. Thomas Brennan wasn't simply bending laws or operating in moral gray areas. He was a genuine outlaw whose criminal activities included robbery and apparently murder. She had traveled across the country to marry a man who was being pursued by federal marshals. Thomas turned to her with an expression that mixed regret with calculation. "Catherine, I'm afraid our wedding will have to be postponed. Current circumstances require my immediate attention." "You're going to flee," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to handle a temporary inconvenience. This ranch has hidden resources and escape routes that those fools will never discover. But you present a complication I hadn't anticipated." Catherine's blood chilled as she realized she had become a liability rather than an asset. "What do you mean?" "I mean that an Eastern school teacher who just arrived on today's train would make an excellent witness for federal investigators. Your testimony about what you've seen and heard here could prove quite damaging to my operations." Billy shifted nervously by the door. "Boss, we need to move. The boys are saddling fresh horses now." Thomas nodded but kept his attention fixed on Catherine, which leaves me with a dilemma. I can't take you with me. You'd slow us down, and you're not equipped for life on the run. But I can't leave you here to tell stories to whatever passes for law enforcement in this godforsaken territory. Catherine felt terror rising in her throat as she understood the implications of his words. She was trapped in an isolated ranch house with a criminal who saw her as a threat to his freedom, surrounded by armed men who clearly followed his orders without question. Her dreams of security and a new life had become a nightmare with potentially fatal consequences. Mrs. Garcia appeared in the doorway, her face carefully neutral despite the obvious tension in the room. "Senator Brennan, the horses are ready. Miguel says you should leave within the hour if you want to reach the border by morning." Thomas pulled a gold watch from his vest pocket and checked the time. "Tell Miguel to prepare the special route through Devil's Canyon. We'll need supplies for at least a week." He turned back to Catherine, his expression unreadable. "As for you, my dear, I think the safest solution for everyone is if you simply disappeared along with us. A tragic accident during your journey, west, thrown from a horse, perhaps, or lost in the desert. These things happen to inexperienced travelers." Catherine's training as a schoolteacher had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but nothing had prepared her for this level of mortal danger. Her mind raced through possible responses, settling on the only option that might buy her time. "Thomas, please consider the attention my disappearance would bring. I sent letters to friends back east describing my journey and destination. If I simply vanish, there will be inquiries. Federal investigators will want to know what happened to the schoolteacher who came to marry Thomas Brennan." He paused, clearly weighing her words. "You make a valid point. Perhaps there's a middle ground that serves everyone's interests." Before he could elaborate, the sound of approaching riders echoed across the desert, not his own men returning, but a larger group moving with the disciplined pace of a law enforcement posse. Through the window, Catherine could see torches flickering in the distance, growing steadily closer to the ranch. "Damn," Thomas muttered, his composure finally cracking. "They're moving faster than Billy anticipated." He grabbed Catherine's arm with a grip that would leave bruises. "Change of plans. You're coming with us after all. If you slow us down or try to escape, I'll leave your body for the coyotes." As armed men began saddling horses and loading supplies, with practiced efficiency, Catherine realized that her carefully planned escape from poverty had led her into a situation where survival itself was uncertain. The criminal she had intended to marry was about to drag her along on a desperate flight from justice, and her fate now depended on the competence of law enforcement officers she had never met and the possibility that someone among Thomas Brennan's men might possess enough conscience to protect an innocent woman caught in circumstances beyond her control. The chaos in the ranch yard unfolded with military precision as Thomas Brennan's men prepared for their escape. Catherine found herself thrust into the center of a well-rehearsed plan that clearly wasn't the first time these criminals had fled from pursuing law enforcement. Billy Harrison appeared at her side, carrying a canvas bag and a split skirt similar to the one she had purchased in Flagstaff. "Ma'am, you need to change this now." "No time for modesty, we ride in 5 minutes," he said, his young face grim with urgency. Catherine clutched the practical clothes, her mind reeling from the speed at which her circumstances had deteriorated. "Billy, you don't have to do this. Whatever crimes Mr. Brennan has committed, you're still young enough to what? Get strung up alongside him?" Billy's laugh held no humor. "Lady, you don't understand how this works. I've been riding with Brennan for 2 years. There ain't no walking away from this life once you're in it." Mrs. Garcia appeared beside them, pressing a water canteen and small pouch into Catherine's hands. "Food for the trail, Senora." And this, she slipped a small knife into Catherine's belt. "Sometimes a woman must protect herself when men cannot." Catherine changed clothes behind a hastily erected blanket, while the sounds of preparation continued around her. The split skirt and practical blouse felt foreign after years of proper Eastern attire, but she recognized their necessity for horseback travel. As she emerged, Thomas approached, leading 2 saddled horses, a sturdy bay mare for her and a powerful black stallion for himself. "Can you ride?" he demanded, checking the cinch on her saddle with practiced efficiency. "I rode as a child, but—" "Nothing like this," Catherine admitted, eyeing the horse with a mixture of fear and determination. "You'll learn quickly, or you won't survive. Stay close to Billy and do exactly what he tells you. If you fall behind, we're not coming back for you." The approaching torches had grown close enough that Catherine could make out individual riders, silhouetted against the desert night. Even at this distance, she could see they moved with the purposeful coordination of experienced lawmen, rather than a hastily assembled posse. Thomas noticed her gaze and followed it to the approaching pursuit. "That would be Sheriff Gabriel Reyes," he said with grudging respect. "Half Comanche, half Mexican, and all trouble. He's been tracking me for the better part of a year." Catherine felt a flicker of hope at the mention of legitimate law enforcement so close, but Thomas seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't get any ideas about signaling our friends out there. Reyes shoots first and asks questions later, especially when it comes to known associates of wanted men. To him, you're just another outlaw now." Billy brought his horse alongside Catherine's mare, checking her stirrups and reins with the care of someone genuinely concerned for her welfare. "Ma'am, this mare's name is Luna. She's sure-footed and smart. Trust her instincts and she'll keep you safe. When we start moving, stay right behind me and don't look back no matter what you hear." Thomas mounted his stallion with fluid grace, signaling to his men with a series of hand gestures that sent them scattering in different directions. Catherine realized this wasn't a simple flight. It was a coordinated deception designed to split the pursuing force and create confusion about their true escape route. "Mount up," Thomas commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Catherine pulled herself into the saddle with less grace than she would have preferred, her muscles already protesting the unaccustomed position. Luna shifted beneath her but remained calm, as if sensing her rider's inexperience and compensating accordingly. The first gunshots echoed across the desert as Thomas's rear guard engaged the approaching posse. Catherine flinched at the sound, her horse dancing nervously until Billy reached over to steady the reins. "That's just to slow them down and make them careful," he explained. "Boss doesn't like killing lawmen unless he has to brings too much heat from the territorial government." They rode out of the ranch yard at a controlled gallop, heading not toward the main trail but into rough country that seemed to offer no path at all. Catherine quickly discovered that riding at speed over uneven terrain bore no resemblance to the gentle canters of her childhood. Every stride sent jolts through her body, and she had to concentrate intensely just to maintain her seat as Luna picked her way through rocky passages and dry creek beds. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter but never disappeared entirely. Thomas led them through a maze of arroyos and hidden trails that spoke of extensive scouting and preparation. This was clearly an escape route he had planned and practiced, with supplies cached at strategic points and alternative paths available if any section became blocked. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes of hard riding, Thomas called a halt in a narrow canyon where towering rock walls provided concealment from observation. Catherine slumped in her saddle, her legs trembling with exhaustion and her hands cramped from gripping the reins. "Water the horses, but don't unsaddle them," Thomas instructed his men. "We've got maybe 20 minutes before they pick up our trail again." Billy helped Catherine dismount, catching her when her legs nearly buckled. "You're doing fine, ma'am. Most folks would have fallen off 3 times by now." Catherine accepted water from the canteen Mrs. Garcia had provided, her throat parched from dust and fear. Around her, Thomas's men moved with quiet efficiency, checking weapons and equipment while maintaining watch on the canyon entrances. She counted 8 men besides Thomas and Billy, a substantial group, but not large enough to fight a sustained battle with determined pursuers. "How long can we keep running?" she asked Billy quietly. "Depends on how bad they want us and how much supplies they brought. Sheriff Reyes is stubborn, but even he's got to turn back eventually if we can stay ahead of him long enough." Thomas appeared beside them, his expression grim. "The good news is they're following exactly where I expected. The bad news is Reyes brought more men than usual. Looks like he called in favors from other jurisdictions." "What's the plan, boss?" Billy asked. "We continue to the border. I've got arrangements in Mexico that will keep us safe until this blows over. But first we need to reach Devil's Canyon and the cache there." Catherine had heard him mention Devil's Canyon earlier, but hadn't understood its significance. "What's at Devil's Canyon?" Thomas studied her for a moment, apparently deciding whether to trust her with operational details. "Supplies, fresh horses, and a hidden trail that leads to a crossing point the Mexican authorities ignore in exchange for certain considerations." The implications of his words were clear. Thomas had bribed Mexican officials to maintain a safe haven across the border. This wasn't the desperate flight of an amateur criminal, but the practiced escape of someone who had invested considerable resources in preparing for exactly this contingency. A distant sound echoed through the canyon, the call of a night bird. That didn't quite ring true. One of Thomas's sentries materialized from the shadows and approached with urgent news. "Boss, they're closing in faster than expected. Looks like they split their force and sent riders ahead to cut off the usual escape routes." Thomas swore with creative profanity that made Catherine blush despite their circumstances. "Reyes is learning. That's what makes him dangerous. What do we do?" Billy asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through tactical options. "We can't outrun them carrying extra weight," he said finally, his gaze settling on Catherine with calculation that made her blood run cold. Catherine straightened in her saddle, recognizing the look of a man considering whether she had become more liability than asset. "I won't slow you down. I can ride as fast and far as necessary. Can you shoot?" Thomas asked bluntly. The derringer in her coat pocket felt impossibly small and inadequate. "I have a gun, but I've never used it. Then you're dead weight if we have to fight." Thomas turned to Billy. "Take her up the side canyon and wait. If we're not back by dawn, get her to Copper Falls and turn her over to the authorities. Tell them she was an innocent victim who escaped during the confusion." Billy's face showed obvious distress at the suggestion. "Boss, I'm not leaving you two. You're following orders. Thomas cut him off. "The lady's presence changes our tactical situation. Without her, we can move faster and take risks we can't afford with the civilian in tow." Catherine realized this was her opportunity, perhaps her only opportunity, to separate herself from these criminals before their situation became completely hopeless. But something about Billy's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by Thomas's reasoning. "Mr. Brennan," she said carefully, "if you're planning to abandon me anyway, why not do it here? I can find my way back to the ranch and explain to the sheriff that I was taken against my will." Thomas's smile held no warmth. "Because, my dear Catherine, you've seen too much and heard too much to simply walk away. Your testimony could hang half my men and send the other half to territorial prison. I'm afraid your involvement in this affair has passed the point where innocence is an option." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to determine exact direction or distance. Thomas's men began mounting their horses. With renewed urgency, their relaxed alertness transforming into combat readiness. "Time to go," Thomas announced. "Billy, take the lady and head for the winter camp. We'll draw them south toward the border and circle back when it's safe." As Billy helped Catherine remount Luna, she caught sight of something that made her heart race with unexpected hope. High on the canyon rim, silhouetted briefly against the star-filled sky, was the figure of a lone rider watching their movements. Even at that distance and in poor light, something about the rider's posture and the set of his shoulders suggested this wasn't one of Thomas's men. Billy noticed her attention and followed her gaze, his face paling when he spotted the observer. "Boss," he called urgently, "we got company on the rim." Thomas looked up and immediately began barking orders. "It's a scout. They know where we are. Everyone mount up now." The camp dissolved into controlled chaos as men threw themselves into saddles and prepared for immediate flight. Catherine found herself caught between Billy's protective instincts and Thomas's ruthless pragmatism as gunshots erupted from multiple directions around the canyon. "This way!" Billy shouted, spurring his horse toward a narrow side passage that Catherine hadn't noticed before. But as they rode toward what Billy clearly believed was safety, Catherine saw more figures appearing on the canyon rim's dark shapes that moved with the fluid grace of experienced riders comfortable in hostile terrain. The net was closing around Thomas Brennan's gang, and she was about to be caught in the middle of what promised to be a deadly confrontation. Billy's horse stumbled on loose rock as they entered the side canyon, throwing him from the saddle with a sickening thud. Catherine pulled Luna to a halt, torn between the instinct to help and the realization that this might be her chance to escape from her captors entirely. "Billy," she called, dismounting to check on the young man who had shown her nothing but kindness despite his criminal associations. Billy groaned and tried to sit up, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "My leg," he gasped. "I think it's broken." Catherine looked back toward the main canyon where gunfire was increasing in intensity, then up at the canyon rim where more riders were appearing. She was trapped between opposing forces with an injured young man who needed medical attention and a horse that represented her only means of escape. A new sound reached her ears. A voice calling out in what sounded like Spanish mixed with another language she didn't recognize. The voice was clear and commanding, cutting through the chaos of gunfire with unmistakable authority. "Thomas Brennan, this is Sheriff Gabriel Reyes. You're surrounded. Send out the woman and surrender your weapons. No one else has to die tonight." Catherine felt a surge of hope at the realization that the law enforcement officer knew about her presence and was concerned for her safety. But Billy grabbed her arm with surprising strength for someone who had just fallen from a horse. "Don't trust him," Billy whispered urgently. "Reyes has his own reputation for justice. Sometimes folks don't make it to trial when he's doing the arresting." Catherine found herself facing an impossible choice. She could try to reach the sheriff and hope his concern for her welfare was genuine, Or she could stay with Billy and risk being branded an accomplice to whatever crimes Thomas Brennan's gang had committed. Either path led toward an uncertain future, but at least with the sheriff she would be moving toward legitimate authority rather than deeper into the criminal underworld. The decision was made for her when a figure appeared at the mouth of the side canyon, a tall man on horseback, silhouetted against the gunfire and chaos behind him. Even in the poor light, Catherine could see he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, and the star pinned to his shirt caught the reflection of distant muzzle flashes. Sheriff Gabriel Reyes had found her, and Catherine Walsh was about to discover whether the half-Comanche lawman represented salvation or simply a different kind of danger in the violent landscape of Arizona territory. Sheriff Gabriel Reyes sat motionless on his horse at the canyon entrance, his dark eyes taking in the scene with methodical precision. Catherine found herself struck by his presence, tall and lean with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. He carried himself with a quiet authority that needed no enforcement through bluster or threats. His black hair was longer than conventional for a lawman, braided with small beads that caught the starlight, and his clothes were a practical mixture of traditional Western wear and what Catherine suspected were items influenced by his Comanche heritage. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air despite being pitched low, "I'm Sheriff Gabriel Reyes from Copper Falls. Are you Catherine Walsh?" Catherine felt relief flood through her at the sound of her own name, spoken by someone who represented legitimate authority. "Yes, Sheriff. I'm unharmed, but this young man is injured and needs medical attention." Reyes dismounted with fluid grace, his hand resting casually on his sidearm as he approached. His eyes never stopped moving, constantly assessing the terrain and potential threats. Even as he focused on Catherine and Billy, she noticed he moved with the silent step of someone trained in tracking and hunting, his boots making virtually no sound on the rocky ground. "Billy Harrison," Reyes acknowledged, kneeling beside the injured young man. "Broken leg, looks like. Could be worse considering the company you keep." Billy struggled to sit up straighter, his face pale with pain and defiance. "Sheriff, Miss Walsh here is innocent. She just arrived on today's train and got caught up in something she didn't understand." Reyes examined Billy's leg with surprisingly gentle hands, his movements suggesting some medical knowledge. "I know exactly when Miss Walsh arrived, son. I was watching the station when you collected her." His gaze shifted to Catherine. "Question is whether she's an innocent victim or whether she knew what kind of man she was coming to marry." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication. "Sheriff, I can assure you that Mr. Brennan's letters contain no hint of criminal activity. He presented himself as a legitimate rancher seeking an educated wife. Most confidence men are skilled at presenting themselves as something they're not," Reyes replied, his tone neutral but not unsympathetic. "Thomas Brennan has been using that same story to recruit accomplices for the better part of 2 years. Young women traveling west alone make excellent cover for his operations." The suggestion that she might have been deliberately targeted as a potential accomplice rather than a genuine bride sent a chill through Catherine. "Are you saying he never intended to marry me?" Reyes fashioned a crude splint for Billy's leg using materials from his saddlebags, his movements efficient and practiced. "I'm saying, Thomas, Brennan's intentions toward anyone are usually connected to how they can be useful to his criminal enterprises. An educated Eastern woman would provide excellent camouflage for money laundering operations and give his gang a respectable front when dealing with territorial authorities." Billy groaned as Reyes secured the splint, but managed to speak through gritted teeth. "Sheriff, whatever Brennan's done, Miss Walsh wasn't part of it. She was just as shocked as anyone when the truth came out." "That may be," Reyes acknowledged, "but being innocent and being able to prove it are two different things. Right now, Miss Walsh was present during the commission of multiple felonies and fled the scene with known criminals. A territorial judge might take a dim view of that, regardless of her original intentions. Catherine felt panic rising in her throat as she realized her legal position might be far more precarious than she had assumed. "Sheriff, surely you don't believe I chose to be here? Mr. Brennan forced me to come with his men when your posse arrived." Reyes finished treating Billy's injury and stood, his attention divided between their conversation and the ongoing gunfight in the main canyon. "What I believe doesn't matter, ma'am. What matters is what can be proven in court. And right now, the only witnesses to your alleged coercion are members of Brennan's gang." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their discussion. Two of Reyes's deputies appeared at the canyon mouth, leading their mounts and moving with the careful alertness of men entering potentially hostile territory. "Sheriff," the older deputy called, "we've got Brennan and 3 of his men pinned down in a box canyon about half a mile south. They're dug in good, but they're not going anywhere." Reyes nodded acknowledgement while continuing to study Catherine's face in the starlight. "Any casualties on our side?" Johnson took a graze on his arm, but nothing serious. "These boys are better at running than fighting." Catherine seized the opportunity to demonstrate her usefulness rather than remaining a burden. "Sheriff, I have some medical training from assisting the town doctor in Vermont. If your deputy needs attention, I'd be happy to help." Reyes raised an eyebrow at this offer. "That's generous, Miss Walsh, but I'm curious why you're so eager to assist law enforcement officers, who might very well arrest you as an accomplice." "Because," Catherine replied with conviction, "regardless of my current circumstances, I know the difference between right and wrong. Mr. Brennan and his men are criminals who threaten my life. You represent legitimate authority trying to bring them to justice. The choice seems clear to me." Something shifted in Reyes's expression, not quite approval, but a recognition of something he hadn't expected to find. "Deputies, bring Johnson here. Miss Walsh claims to have medical experience." As they waited for the injured deputy, Reyes began asking Catherine detailed questions about her experience at the ranch, her conversations with Thomas Brennan, and her observations of his operation. Catherine found herself impressed by the sheriff's methodical approach and obvious intelligence. His questions revealed extensive knowledge of Brennan's criminal network and suggested months of careful investigation. "You mentioned altered brands on some of the horses," Reyes said. "Did you notice any specific patterns or timing to the alterations?" Catherine closed her eyes, recalling the details that had troubled her during her brief time at the ranch. Several horses in the main corral had fresh burns over older brand marks. The work looked recent, within the past few weeks, I'd guess. And the men seemed nervous around those particular animals, as if they expected someone to come looking for them. That matches what we know about a string of horses stolen from the Morrison Ranch 3 weeks ago. The thieves killed old Morrison when he tried to stop them. Reyes watched Catherine's reaction carefully. Billy there was identified as one of the riders. Catherine turned to look at Billy, who had been quietly listening to their conversation. "Billy, is that true? Did you participate in a robbery that resulted in murder?" Billy's young face crumpled with shame and defiance. "I held the horses while the others went into the house. I didn't know they were planning to hurt anyone. Brennan said it would be a simple theft, take the horses and leave." "But someone died," Catherine said softly, her heart breaking for the young man who seemed caught between loyalty to his criminal associates and recognition of the consequences of his choices. "Yeah," Billy whispered. "Someone died, and I can't take that back no matter how sorry I am." Reyes's deputy arrived leading a wounded man whose arm was bound with a makeshift bandage already soaked through with blood. Catherine immediately moved to examine the injury, grateful for something concrete she could do to help rather than simply being a burden to be protected or a suspect to be guarded. "The bullet passed through cleanly," she diagnosed after carefully unwrapping the deputy's arm. "No bone damage that I can detect, but it needs proper cleaning and stitching to prevent infection." Using water from her canteen and supplies from Reyes's saddlebags, Catherine cleaned and dressed the wound with competent efficiency. The injured deputy, a weathered man named Johnson, watched her work with obvious surprise. "Ma'am, you've got steadier hands than most frontier doctors I've met," he commented as she secured a fresh bandage. "Where'd you learn to tend wounds like that?" "My father was frequently called upon to assist Dr. Morrison in our town when medical emergencies arose," Catherine explained. "He believed practical knowledge was as important as book learning, so he taught me basic medical procedures along with mathematics and literature." Reyes observed her work with growing interest. "That's an unusual education for a young lady." Catherine finished treating the deputy's wound and began cleaning the medical supplies. "My father believed women should be capable of supporting themselves and contributing meaningfully to their communities. Not all parents share that philosophy, but it served me well in circumstances I never could have anticipated. Like being kidnapped by outlaws and tending gunshot wounds in a desert canyon," Reyes said, with what might have been the hint of a smile. "Exactly like that," Catherine replied, meeting his gaze directly. "Sheriff, I understand my legal position is complicated, but I hope my actions tonight demonstrate where my loyalties lie. I want to help you bring Thomas Brennan to justice, both for his crimes and for the deception he practiced against me." Reyes was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face as if trying to read her character in the starlight. "Miss Walsh, I'm going to make you an offer. But before I do, you need to understand that accepting it will put you in considerable danger and require you to trust me completely." Catherine felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of offer?" "Thomas Brennan's criminal network extends far beyond horse theft and robbery. He's been laundering money for larger criminal organizations, bribing territorial officials, and providing safe passage for wanted men fleeing to Mexico. Breaking up his operation requires more than simply arresting him. It requires dismantling the entire network and identifying his contacts throughout the territory." "And how does that involve me?" Reyes glanced at Billy, who was listening to their conversation with obvious anxiety. "Brennan's escape routes and safe houses are known only to his inner circle, but he also keeps detailed records of his operations for purposes of blackmail and leverage. Those records are hidden somewhere only he and his most trusted associates know about." Catherine began to understand where this conversation was leading. "You want me to help you locate those records? I want you to help me infiltrate what's left of his organization after tonight. Brennan will need to regroup and reorganize after this setback. He'll be looking for people he can trust, and an educated woman who is wronged by law enforcement might be exactly what he needs." The proposal was both thrilling and terrifying. Catherine had never imagined herself as anything more adventurous than a frontier schoolteacher, yet circumstances were offering her the chance to play a meaningful role in bringing criminals to justice. "That sounds extremely dangerous," she said carefully. "It is," Reyes acknowledged. "Brennan kills people who betray him, and if he suspects you're working with law enforcement, you'll disappear into the desert where nobody will ever find your body." Billy struggled to sit up straighter despite his broken leg. "Sheriff, you can't ask her to do that. She's not trained for undercover work, and Brennan's suspicious of everyone right now. He'll see right through her." Reyes turned his attention to the young outlaw. "Billy, you've got two choices ahead of you. You can stand trial for your part in Morrison's murder and likely hang, or you can help me bring down Brennan and his organization in exchange for a reduced sentence. What are you suggesting?" Billy asked warily. "I'm suggesting that an injured young man who helped an innocent woman escape from his criminal associates might be exactly the kind of redemption story that territorial judges appreciate, especially if that same young man provided crucial assistance in dismantling a major criminal network." Catherine saw the hope flicker in Billy's eyes, followed immediately by fear. "Brennan would kill me if he found out I was working with you." "Brennan's Going to kill you anyway if he thinks you're a liability, Reyes pointed out. At least this way you have a chance to make amends for Morrison's death and maybe build a different kind of life. The conversation was interrupted by gunfire from the main canyon, not the sporadic shots they had been hearing, but a sustained barrage that suggested a major engagement. Reyes immediately moved to a position where he could observe the main canyon while remaining in cover. "Sounds like Brennan's making his move," he said. "We need to make decisions quickly." Catherine found herself at another crossroads, but this time the choice felt different. Instead of choosing between bad options, she was being offered the chance to actively participate in bringing justice to men who had threatened her life and deceived her about their intentions. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "if I agree to help you, what guarantees do I have that the territorial authorities will recognize my cooperation rather than simply viewing me as another criminal to be prosecuted?" Reyes pulled a document from his shirt pocket and handed it to her. "This is a federal marshal's commission authorizing me to recruit civilian agents for special investigations. Any assistance you provide will be officially recognized and protected under territorial law." Catherine examined the document as best she could in the poor light, noting the official seals and signatures that suggested its authenticity. "And Billy? What assurances does he have?" "His cooperation will be documented and presented to the territorial judge as a mitigating factor. I can't guarantee the outcome, but I can guarantee he'll have a chance to prove his willingness to make amends." Billy looked between Catherine and the sheriff, his young face showing the strain of someone forced to make adult decisions with life or death consequences. "Miss Walsh, you don't owe me anything. Don't risk your life trying to help me." Catherine knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Billy, you protected me when you could have simply followed orders. You warned me about dangers when you didn't have to. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption, and if I can help you find that chance while also ensuring that Thomas Brennan faces justice for his crimes, then I consider that a worthwhile risk." She turned to Reyes with a resolution that surprised her. "Sheriff, I accept your offer. Tell me what you need me to do." For the first time since she had met him, Gabriel Reyes smiled, a brief expression that transformed his weathered features and hinted at warmth beneath his professional competence. "Miss Walsh, I think you're going to discover that you're far more formidable than you ever imagined." As the sounds of gunfire intensified in the distance and plans began taking shape for an operation that would either bring down a major criminal network or cost them all their lives, Catherine Walsh realized that her journey west had led her far from the safe, predictable life she had planned. But for the first time since leaving Vermont, she felt she was exactly where she belonged. The plan that Sheriff Gabriel Reyes outlined in the pre-dawn darkness was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Catherine would return to Copper Falls as the traumatized victim of Thomas Brennan's deception, seeking sanctuary while secretly gathering intelligence on his remaining network. Billy, officially captured but privately cooperating, would provide crucial information about safe houses and communication methods. Together, they would help Reyes identify and arrest the corrupt officials and criminal contacts that made Brennan's operations possible. "The key," Reyes explained as his deputies secured the canyon and tended to prisoners, "is that Brennan escaped tonight. He'll interpret that as a victory and assume you're either dead or too frightened to pose a threat. That overconfidence will make him careless." Catherine adjusted the torn sleeve of her blouse, part of the careful staging that would support her cover story. "How long before he attempts to re-establish contact with his network?" "Within a week, according to Billy's information. He has money cached in 3 locations and weapons stored in at least 2 safe houses. Plus, his Mexican contacts will expect him to honor existing agreements regardless of his current difficulties. Billy, his broken leg now properly splinted, and his story carefully rehearsed, looked up from where he sat propped against a boulder. The problem is Miguel Santos. He runs Brennan's operation in Tucson and doesn't trust anybody he hasn't known for years. If he suspects Miss Walsh is working with law enforcement, Santos won't hesitate to kill her, Reyes finished grimly. Which is why this operation depends on perfect execution and a fair amount of luck. As dawn approached, the reality of what Catherine had agreed to undertake became increasingly daunting. She would be entering a world of professional criminals, with only minimal training and no backup except for Reyes's promise that help would be available when needed. One mistaken character, one moment of hesitation or fear, could expose her deception with fatal consequences. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "I need to know more about your background. If I'm going to trust you with my life, I should understand who you are and why you're qualified to lead this kind of operation." Reyes considered her request for a moment before nodding. "Fair question. My mother was Comanche, captured during a raid when she was 16, and later married to a Mexican rancher who treated her well. I grew up speaking 3 languages and moving between 3 worlds: Comanche, Mexican, and American. That background taught me to read people and situations in ways that most lawmen can't." He paused, his gaze distant as he recalled painful memories. "I became a sheriff because territorial law failed my family when land grabbers murdered my stepfather and tried to steal our ranch. The local authorities were either bought off or too intimidated to investigate. I learned that justice in the territory requires someone willing to work outside conventional methods when necessary." Catherine heard the parallel to her own situation in his words. "And that's why you're willing to use unconventional agents like me. That's why I'm willing to trust people who prove they understand the difference between right and wrong, regardless of their official credentials." Reyes met her gaze directly. "Catherine, you've shown more courage and integrity in one night than most people display in a lifetime. If you can maintain that strength for the next few weeks, we can end Thomas Brennan's reign of terror permanently." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Reyes's remaining deputies were returning with news about the night's engagement and the disposition of captured gang members. Deputy Martinez, a compact man with intelligent eyes, dismounted and approached with obvious urgency. "Sheriff, we've got problems. Brennan escaped during the firefight, but that's not the worst news. We captured his lieutenant, Jake Morrison turns out he's got information about a territorial judge who's been taking bribes." Catherine felt her blood chill as she recognized the implications. If there are corrupt officials in the territorial government, how can we trust any legal proceedings? Reyes's expression darkened with anger that had clearly been building for months. Because Judge Harrison in Tucson isn't just taking bribes, he's been systematically releasing captured gang members and warning them about planned law enforcement operations. Half my investigations over the past year have been compromised before they started. That's why you need to work outside official channels, Catherine realized. You can't trust your own government to support legitimate law enforcement. Exactly. And it's why this operation is so dangerous. If Judge Harrison learns about our plans, Brennan will be waiting for us with superior numbers and advance warning about every move we make. Deputy Martinez continued his report, his voice grim with implications. "There's more, Sheriff. Morrison says Brennan's planning something bigger. Territorial bank robbery in Phoenix that would give him enough money to disappear permanently into Mexico." Billy struggled to sit up straighter, his face pale with alarm. "When?" Brennan mentioned Phoenix, but I thought he was just talking about expanding operations. According to Morrison, 3 days from now. Apparently, Brennan's been planning this for months as his retirement job. The Territorial Bank holds federal payroll money for army posts throughout Arizona. We're talking about enough cash to fund a small army. Catherine felt the scope of the crisis expanding beyond anything she had imagined. "Sheriff, if he succeeds in robbing the Territorial Bank, how many people will die in the process?" Bank robberies in frontier towns usually leave multiple casualties. Reyes replied grimly. Brennan's men aren't known for their restraint when facing resistance. We could be looking at a dozen or more innocent deaths. The weight of responsibility settled on Catherine's shoulders like a physical burden. Her decision to help with this operation had seemed difficult enough when the stakes involved bringing criminals to justice. Now it had become a race to prevent. A massacre that would devastate families throughout the territory. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Reyes outlined the plan with military precision. Catherine would return to Copper Falls with a story about escaping during the confusion of the gunfight. She would seek shelter with sympathetic townspeople while secretly making contact with Brennan's remaining network through coded messages Billy would provide. Meanwhile, Reyes would use official channels to investigate the Phoenix Bank security while privately preparing a trap that would capture Brennan and his accomplices. The crucial element, Reyes emphasized, is timing. We need Brennan to believe his Phoenix operation is proceeding according to plan until the moment we spring the trap. If he suspects interference, he'll either change the target or postpone the robbery until our guard is down. Billy provided detailed information about communication codes and meeting places that Brennan's network used throughout the territory. Miguel Santos meets contacts at the Copper Falls Saloon every Tuesday night, he explained. He'll be expecting word from Brennan about regrouping after last night's setback. Catherine memorized the locations and signals that would allow her to make contact with Santos without arousing suspicion. The plan required her to pose as a bitter, desperate woman seeking revenge against the law enforcement officers who had disrupted her wedding plans and left her stranded in hostile territory. Remember, Reyes cautioned, Santos is professionally paranoid and extremely violent. If he suspects you're not who you claim to be, he won't hesitate to kill you and dispose of your body where it will never be found. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the desert landscape, the reality of their situation became starkly apparent. Catherine was about to enter the most dangerous phase of an operation that could save lives throughout the territory or result in her own death at the hands of ruthless criminals. The journey back to Copper Falls took place in stages designed to support Catherine's cover story. Reyes's deputies escorted her part of the way, then released her to make her own way into town as a traumatized victim seeking help. Billy, officially a prisoner but secretly a cooperating witness, would be transported separately to maintain the illusion that he had been captured rather than surrendering voluntarily. As Catherine rode Luna through the outskirts of Copper Falls, she rehearsed her story one final time. She was a betrayed mail-order bride who had discovered her intended husband's criminal nature and barely escaped with her life. She harbored resentment toward the law enforcement officers whose interference had left her stranded without resources or protection. She was desperate enough to consider any opportunity for survival, including association with people who operated outside legal boundaries. The performance would require her to suppress every instinct toward honesty and cooperation she had developed over 24 years of life. Instead, she would need to embrace deception and moral ambiguity while maintaining enough authenticity to fool professional criminals who made their living by reading people's true intentions. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house proprietor, received Catherine's arrival with the sympathy and horror appropriate to her supposed ordeal. Word of the previous night's gunfight had already reached town, along with exaggerated stories about kidnapped women and desperate outlaws fleeing into the desert. "You poor dear," Mrs. Henderson exclaimed, helping Catherine from her horse and noting the carefully arranged signs of her supposed hardship. "Come inside immediately. You need food and rest, and then we'll send word to your family back east." Catherine allowed herself to be led into the boarding house while maintaining the demeanor of someone in shock from traumatic experiences. "Mrs. Henderson, I don't have family to contact. Mr. Brennan was my only prospect for security, and now I don't know what I'm going to do." The genuine desperation in her voice wasn't entirely feigned, although her current circumstances differed dramatically from her cover story. Catherine was indeed a woman far from home with limited resources and an uncertain future. The main difference was that she had chosen to actively participate in shaping that future rather than simply hoping for rescue. That evening, as Catherine sat in the boarding house parlor, listening to other residents discuss the previous night's excitement, she overheard information that confirmed Billy's intelligence about criminal network operations in Copper Falls. Two men at a corner table spoke in low voices about delayed shipments and changed meeting schedules, exactly the kind of disruption that Brennan's escape would have caused to ongoing criminal enterprises. Catherine approached the bar with the careful hesitation of someone seeking information she wasn't sure she should want. "Excuse me," she said to the bartender, "but I couldn't help overhearing the talk about Mr. Brennan. People in town seem to know more about his business interests than I was led to believe." The bartender, a weathered man named Pete, who clearly knew everyone's business, studied her with shrewd eyes. "You're the school teacher who came out to marry him, aren't you? Heard you had quite an adventure last night." "Adventure isn't the word I would use," Catherine replied with bitter accuracy. "Mr. Brennan's deception has left me in an impossible situation. I have no money for travel back east, no prospects for employment here, and a reputation that's probably ruined throughout the territory." Pete's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "Miss, I've seen other women get caught up in situations they didn't understand. Sometimes a person's got to be practical about survival, even if it means making choices that wouldn't look proper back east." Catherine recognized the opening she had been seeking. "What kind of choices?" "Well," Pete said quietly, glancing around. To ensure their conversation remained private, there are people in the territory who help folks in difficult circumstances. Not necessarily through official channels, if you understand my meaning." "I'm not sure I do," Catherine lied, playing the part of someone naive about criminal networks but desperate enough to consider questionable alternatives. Pete leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Tuesday nights there's a gentleman who comes to town who helps people with irregular employment opportunities, Miguel Santos. He's got connections throughout the territory for folks who aren't particular about working inside the law." Catherine felt her pulse quicken as the first phase of her infiltration operation fell into place exactly as Reyes had predicted. "What kind of work?" "Depends on your skills and how much risk you're willing to accept. Santos has associates who need help with bookkeeping, transportation arrangements, communication services. For an educated woman like yourself, there might be opportunities that pay well enough to get you back on your feet." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Henderson, who had been searching for Catherine with obvious concern. "My dear, you shouldn't be troubling yourself with business matters so soon after your ordeal. You need rest and time to recover from your trauma." Catherine allowed herself to be led away, but not before exchanging a meaningful glance with Pete that suggested she would be returning to continue their discussion. As she prepared for bed in her small room, Catherine reflected on how quickly she had adapted to deception and manipulation, the skills that had made her an effective teacher reading people's motivations, adapting her approach to different personalities, maintaining authority while appearing approachable translated surprisingly well to undercover work. But as she lay awake listening to the sounds of Copper Falls settling into nighttime quiet, Catherine couldn't escape the knowledge that her real test lay ahead. Tomorrow she would begin actively seeking contact with Miguel Santos and Thomas Brennan's criminal network. Within days, she would either be providing crucial intelligence that would prevent a massacre in Phoenix, or she would be another victim of the violent men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operations. The irony wasn't lost on her that Catherine Walsh, the schoolteacher who had traveled west seeking security and respectability as a rancher's wife, was about to embark on the most dangerous adventure of her life by pretending to embrace the very criminality she was secretly working to destroy. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, Catherine realized that for the first time since leaving Vermont, she felt truly alive and purposeful. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it as an active participant in her own destiny, rather than a passive victim of circumstances beyond her control. The next morning brought fresh challenges as Catherine began implementing her cover story. In earnest, she made a point of appearing at the general store looking disheveled and desperate, purchasing basic supplies with the few coins she possessed while making subtle inquiries about employment opportunities for women in difficult circumstances. The storekeeper's wife, a gossipy woman named Mrs. Patterson, proved invaluable in spreading word throughout the community about Catherine's supposed plight. "That poor dear," Mrs. Patterson confided to other customers within Catherine's hearing. "Betrayed by that outlaw Brennan and left with nothing but the clothes on her back. She's asking about any kind of work, even things that might not be entirely proper for a lady of her education." The performance required Catherine to swallow her pride and appear increasingly desperate as the day progressed. She visited the hotel restaurant seeking employment as a serving girl, only to be told they had no positions available. She inquired at the blacksmith shop about bookkeeping work, receiving polite but firm refusals. Each rejection was genuine enough to support her cover story while positioning her as someone who might consider less legitimate opportunities out by afternoon. Word of her situation had reached the ears of exactly the people Reyes had hoped would take notice. A Mexican man in his 30s, well-dressed but carrying himself with the alert wariness of someone accustomed to danger, appeared at the boarding house asking to speak with the senorita who had troubles with Sarah Brennan. Catherine recognized him immediately from Billy's description. Miguel Santos, Brennan's lieutenant who managed criminal operations throughout southern Arizona territory. Santos was shorter than she had expected, but carried himself with compact authority, his dark eyes missing nothing as they assessed her appearance and demeanor. "Senorita Walsh," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I understand you have experienced difficulties with your recent business arrangements." Catherine allowed careful hope to enter her expression while maintaining the bitter edge she had been cultivating. "Mr. Santos, I believe. I'm afraid my business arrangements, as you put it, have left me in quite desperate circumstances." Santos's smile revealed gold teeth that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. "Perhaps we should discuss your situation somewhere more private. I understand you are a woman of education and practical skills." They adjourned to a corner table in the hotel dining room, where Santos ordered coffee and studied Catherine with the calculating attention of a man evaluating potential assets. Catherine found herself genuinely nervous under his scrutiny, knowing that any false note in her performance could result in immediate death. "I have heard," Santos said carefully, "that Senator Brennan's deception has left you with negative feelings toward the local authorities who disrupted your wedding plans." Catherine allowed her voice to carry the resentment that wasn't entirely feigned. "Sheriff Reyes and his men showed no concern for my welfare when they attacked the ranch. I was caught in crossfire and forced to flee for my life through a desert that could have killed me. Their justice nearly made me another casualty." Santos nodded approvingly at her bitterness. "The law in this territory is often more concerned with appearing heroic than protecting innocent people. It creates opportunities for those who understand that survival sometimes requires flexibility in one's moral boundaries." "What kind of opportunities?" Catherine asked, leaning forward with carefully calculated eagerness. "I represent certain business interests that require the services of educated individuals who can maintain discretion and follow instructions precisely. The work pays well, but it requires trust and loyalty that cannot be broken." Catherine felt her heart racing as she realized she was being recruited exactly as Reyes had predicted. "Mr. Santos, I need honest work that will allow me to rebuild my life." I'm not interested in charity, but I'm also not in a position to be overly particular about the exact nature of the employment. Santos's expression grew more serious as he evaluated her response. The work I speak of involves maintaining records and facilitating communication between business associates who operate throughout the territory. Some of these associates conduct their affairs outside conventional legal frameworks, which requires absolute discretion from employees. Are you asking if I'm willing to work with people who operate outside the law? I am asking if you are practical enough to understand that frontier survival sometimes requires association with people whose methods differ from those you learned about in your Eastern schools. Catherine met his gaze directly, channeling the desperation that was real even if its sources differed from her cover story. Mr. Santos, Thomas Brennan's deception cost me everything I owned and left me stranded in hostile territory. The law offered me no protection and showed no concern for my welfare. I'm beginning to understand that survival out here requires a different kind of education than what I received in Vermont. Santos smiled with genuine satisfaction at her response. Excellent. Then perhaps we can discuss specific arrangements. I have associates who require assistance with record keeping and correspondence management. The work involves travel between various locations throughout the territory and requires someone who can read and write in both English and Spanish. Catherine felt a surge of excitement as she realized the scope of access this position would provide to Brennan's operations. I speak some Spanish, though I'm far from fluent. Would that be sufficient? Your other qualifications compensate for linguistic limitations. More importantly, you understand the value of discretion and loyalty. Santos leaned back in his chair, apparently having made his decision. The position pays $50 monthly, plus expenses for travel and accommodation. In return, you maintain complete confidentiality about all business matters and follow instructions without question or hesitation. The salary was more than Catherine had earned as a schoolteacher. Further evidence of the criminal network's profitable operations. When would I begin? Tomorrow evening. There is a business meeting in Tucson that requires someone to maintain records and handle correspondence. You would accompany me as my assistant and begin learning the specific requirements of your new position. Catherine nodded acceptance while fighting to control her expression. The Tucson meeting was almost certainly connected to planning for the Phoenix bank robbery, meaning she would be present for discussions that could provide crucial intelligence for preventing the attack. Mr. Santos, I appreciate this opportunity more than I can express. You're offering me a chance to rebuild my life when I thought all possibilities had been destroyed. Senorita Walsh, I believe we understand each other perfectly. The frontier requires people who can adapt to circumstances and recognize opportunities when they arise. You strike me as exactly that kind of woman. As Santos prepared to leave, he handed Catherine a small leather pouch containing advance payment for her services. Purchase appropriate traveling clothes and be ready to depart at sunset tomorrow. We will be meeting with associates who appreciate professional appearance and competent assistance. Catherine watched him walk away with a mixture of triumph and terror. She had successfully infiltrated Brennan's criminal network and would soon be attending meetings that could provide the intelligence needed to prevent a massacre. But she was also now completely committed to a course of action that would almost certainly result in her death if her deception was discovered. That evening, Catherine sent a carefully coded message to Sheriff Reyes through channels Billy had established, confirming that the first phase of their operation had succeeded. Tomorrow she would begin the most dangerous masquerade of her life, posing as a willing criminal accomplice while secretly gathering evidence that could bring down an entire network of territorial outlaws. As she prepared for what might be her final night of safety, Catherine reflected on how completely her life had changed since stepping off the train in Copper Falls. The frightened schoolteacher, seeking security through marriage, had transformed into an undercover agent willing to risk everything for justice. The transformation felt both terrifying and liberating, as if she had finally discovered who she was meant to become. The journey to Tucson with Miguel Santos proved more educational than Catherine had anticipated. As they rode through the harsh Arizona landscape, Santos gradually revealed details about the criminal network's operations that confirmed Sheriff Reyes's suspicions about the scope of territorial corruption. The organization wasn't simply a band of horse thieves and bank robbers. It was a sophisticated enterprise with connections reaching into territorial government, military supply contracts, and cross-border smuggling operations. Senorita Walsh, Santos explained as they paused to water their horses at a hidden spring. Success in our business requires understanding that the law is merely another commodity to be bought and sold. Judge Harrison in Tucson has been most cooperative in ensuring that our associates receive fair treatment in his courtroom. Catherine maintained her expression of eager attention while mentally cataloging every detail for her eventual report. To Reyes, how many judges throughout the territory understand the practical necessities of frontier business? Santos's smile revealed his gold teeth in the afternoon sunlight. Enough to ensure that our operations continue without excessive interference from federal authorities. The territorial government recognizes that economic development requires flexibility in law enforcement. The implications were staggering. If Santos was telling the truth, Brennan's network had purchased protection from multiple territorial officials, creating a web of corruption that extended far beyond simple criminal activity. Catherine realized she was gathering intelligence that could reshape law enforcement throughout Arizona territory. As they approached Tucson, Santos provided final instructions about her role during the upcoming meeting. You will maintain detailed records of all financial discussions and correspondence requirements. Our associates appreciate precise documentation of agreements and obligations. Most importantly, you will demonstrate absolute discretion about all matters discussed. The meeting location was the back room of a restaurant that appeared respectable from the outside, but clearly served as a front for less legitimate activities. Catherine found herself in the presence of 5 men whose appearances ranged from successful businessmen to obviously dangerous criminals. The contrast reinforced her understanding that this organization operated at multiple levels of territorial society. Thomas Brennan arrived an hour after the meeting began, his entrance creating a noticeable shift in the room's atmosphere. Catherine hadn't seen him since their escape from his ranch, and she was struck by how his recent setbacks had affected his appearance. The confident charm he had displayed during her first evening at the Double Creek Ranch had been replaced by harder edges and constant vigilance. "Gentlemen," Brennan announced, taking his place at the head of the table, "recent complications require adjustments to our operational timeline. The Phoenix Bank robbery proceeds as planned, but with enhanced security measures and modified escape routes." Catherine maintained her focus on the detailed notes she was required to take while listening to discussions that would provide Reyes with exactly the intelligence needed to prevent the robbery. Brennan outlined a plan that involved simultaneous attacks on the bank and the telegraph office, preventing immediate communication with territorial authorities while his men loaded federal payroll money destined for Army posts throughout the territory. "The operation requires precise timing," Brennan continued, spreading a hand-drawn map across the table. "Santos, your men hit the telegraph office at exactly 11:30. My team enters the bank at 11:45. By noon, we're riding south toward the Mexican border with enough money to fund operations for the next 5 years. Judge Harrison, a distinguished man in his 60s whose presence at this meeting confirmed the depth of territorial corruption, raised concerns about federal investigation following such a high-profile robbery. "Thomas, stealing Army payroll will bring martial attention that can't be bought off or intimidated. Are you certain the potential gains justify the risks?" Brennan's expression hardened with determination that bordered on desperation. "Judge, recent setbacks have cost us significant resources and manpower. This operation restores our financial position and eliminates the need for smaller robberies that create ongoing exposure to law enforcement. Catherine noticed Santos studying her reaction to these discussions with the calculating attention of someone professionally suspicious of everyone around him. She maintained her expression of dutiful concentration while fighting the impulse to reveal her horror at the casual discussion of violence and theft. The senorita seems unusually attentive to our business matters, Santos observed, his tone carrying a subtle threat. Perhaps she should explain her particular interest in operational details. Catherine felt her blood chill as every eye in the room focused on her with sudden suspicion. This was the moment Reyes had warned her about when professional criminals tested newcomers through direct challenge that could turn deadly in seconds. "Mr. Santos," she replied, maintaining steady eye contact while keeping her voice level. "Mr. Brennan's deception taught me the importance of understanding exactly what I'm involved with. I prefer to know the full scope of my responsibilities rather than discovering unpleasant surprises later." Brennan laughed with apparent approval of her response. Catherine has excellent reasons for thorough understanding. Sheriff Reyes's interference cost her everything she owned and left her stranded in hostile territory. She's learned that survival requires practical accommodation with reality. "Is that true, senorita?" Santos pressed. "You harbor resentment toward the law enforcement officers who disrupted your wedding plans?" Catherine drew upon genuine emotions while directing them toward a false target. "Sheriff Reyes and his men showed no concern for my welfare when they attacked the ranch. I was forced to flee through a desert that could have killed me also. They could play heroes for the territorial newspapers. Their version of justice nearly made me another casualty." The bitterness in her voice convinced the assembled criminals that her motivations were authentic. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly at her explanation. "The territorial authorities often demonstrate more enthusiasm for dramatic gestures than competent investigation," he commented. "Innocent people frequently suffer, while sheriffs pursue glory through spectacular arrests." Brennan seized the opportunity to reinforce Catherine's cover story. Catherine's experience with Reyes demonstrates why our organization provides necessary services that official law enforcement fails to offer. We protect people from corrupt officials who prioritize their own advancement over justice. Catherine felt sick at hearing her fabricated story used to justify criminal activity, but she maintained her expression of grateful agreement while continuing to document discussions that would soon be used to destroy this entire network. Meeting continued for 3 hours as participants refined details of the Phoenix operation and discussed contingency plans for various complications. Catherine learned that Brennan had recruited additional gunmen from his Mexican contacts, bringing his force to 15 armed men for the bank robbery. The operation was planned with military precision, including predetermined escape routes, supply caches, and rendezvous points for regrouping after the attack. Most disturbing was the casual discussion of expected casualties. Brennan acknowledged that bank employees and customers would likely resist, requiring his men to use whatever force necessary to complete their mission. The criminals showed no concern for innocent lives that would be lost during their pursuit of financial gain. "Resistance will be minimal if we move quickly and demonstrate our willingness to use violence," Brennan explained. "Frontier banks rarely employ more than 2 armed guards, and most customers will cooperate rather than risk their lives for someone else's money." Judge Harrison provided crucial intelligence about Phoenix law enforcement capabilities. The local sheriff has 6 deputies available on any given day. Response time from the territorial marshal's office is approximately 4 hours, assuming someone manages to send word immediately after the robbery. Catherine documented every detail while calculating how to transmit this intelligence to Reyes in time for him to organize an effective response. The challenge was maintaining her cover while ensuring that information reached legitimate law enforcement before Brennan's deadline. As the meeting concluded, Santos announced arrangements for Catherine's ongoing employment with the organization. Senorita Walsh will accompany me to our Flagstaff operations next week to establish record-keeping systems for our Northern Territory activities. Her skills will prove valuable in expanding our business relationships. Catherine accepted this assignment while recognizing it as both opportunity and trap. Working directly with Santos would provide access to intelligence about the network's broader operations, but it would also place her under constant scrutiny from someone whose survival depended on identifying threats to the organization. That evening, Catherine was housed in a room above the restaurant where the meeting had taken place. Santos stationed guards in the hallway, ostensibly for her protection, but clearly also to monitor her activities. She waited until after midnight before attempting to send coded messages to Reyes through the emergency communication methods Billy had taught her. The system involved leaving specific items in predetermined locations around Tucson, where Reyes is. Confederates would collect them and forward the intelligence to law enforcement headquarters. Catherine used her position as Santos's assistant to justify late-night walks around the building, claiming she needed fresh air after the stress of her first day of criminal employment. The message she left contained detailed information about the Phoenix bank robbery, including timing, personnel, escape routes, and expected resistance. More importantly, it identified Judge Harrison's involvement and provided evidence of the broader corruption network that had been protecting criminal operations throughout the territory. Returning to her room without detection required all the stealth Catherine could manage. The guards in the hallway appeared asleep, but she suspected at least one was maintaining covert surveillance of her movements. Any behavior that suggested she was more than a desperate schoolteacher seeking employment could result in immediate execution. The next morning brought news that validated Catherine's decision to risk everything for this intelligence operation. A rider arrived with word that federal marshals were en route to Phoenix to investigate reports of planned criminal activity against federal installations. The timing suggested that Reyes had received Catherine's message and immediately contacted higher authorities. Brennan's reaction to this news revealed the importance of the intelligence Catherine had provided. His careful confidence transformed into barely controlled fury as he realized someone had betrayed operational details to law enforcement. "Someone in this organization has been talking to federal authorities," he announced to the assembled criminals. "The marshals know too much about our Phoenix plans for this to be coincidental." Santos immediately focused suspicion on Catherine as the newest member of their group. "Senator Brennan, perhaps we should question our recent recruit more thoroughly about her true loyalties." Catherine felt terror rise in her throat as she recognized how quickly her situation could turn fatal. But she also realized this moment represented an opportunity to demonstrate loyalty while providing Reyes with additional intelligence about the organization's structure. "Mr. Brennan," she said with carefully calculated indignation, "I resent the implication that I would betray people who offered me employment when I had nowhere else to turn. But if there's a traitor in your organization, perhaps we should consider who else had access to operational details." Brennan's eyes sharpened with interest at her suggestion. "Explain." Judge Harrison knew every detail about Phoenix law enforcement capabilities and federal response times. If someone with his political connections wanted to eliminate criminal competition while appearing to support law enforcement, providing selective intelligence to federal marshals would accomplish both objectives. The accusation was a desperate gambit that could either deflect suspicion from Catherine or result in immediate retaliation from Harrison's supporters. But Catherine recognized that her survival depended on appearing more cunning than desperate, more valuable than threatening. Santos studied her with renewed respect as he considered the implications of her analysis. The senorita raises interesting possibilities. Judge Harrison's position provides many opportunities for profitable betrayal. Brennan's expression grew thoughtful as he weighed Catherine's suggestion against his own suspicions about recent setbacks. "Harrison has been pushing for higher percentages of our profits lately. Maybe he decided elimination was more profitable than partnership. The accusation gained momentum as other criminals recalled their own suspicions about Harrison's recent behavior. Catherine watched with fascination and horror as the organization turned against one of its most valuable assets, based on her calculated misdirection. Judge Harrison's protests of innocence only increased suspicion among men whose survival depended on constant paranoia about betrayal. Within an hour, the judge who had provided crucial protection for criminal operations was dead, shot by Santos as an example to potential traitors. Catherine felt sick at witnessing the murder she had indirectly caused, but she recognized that Harrison's death also eliminated a major source of corruption within the territorial government. Her misdirection had removed a criminal asset while protecting her own cover, though at a cost that would haunt her conscience. The elimination of Judge Harrison created chaos within the organization as members questioned each other's loyalty and reconsidered operational security. Brennan decided to accelerate the Phoenix robbery timeline, moving the operation to the following day before federal marshals could establish effective countermeasures. "We proceed tomorrow at dawn," he announced. "Modified plans, reduced personnel, maximum speed. Get in, get the money, and disappear before anyone knows what happened." Catherine realized she had less than 24 hours to transmit updated intelligence to Reyes while maintaining her cover among increasingly paranoid criminals. The success of her mission now depended on her ability to communicate final operational details without being detected by men who had just demonstrated their willingness to kill suspected traitors without hesitation. That night, as Catherine prepared for what she knew would be the culminating phase of her undercover operation, she reflected on how completely she had been transformed by circumstances. The frightened schoolteacher who had arrived in Copper Falls seeking security through marriage had become someone capable of manipulating professional criminals and indirectly causing a corrupt official's death. The transformation felt both liberating and terrifying. Catherine had discovered capabilities she never suspected she possessed, but she had also learned that survival in the frontier required moral compromises that challenged everything she had believed about herself. Tomorrow would reveal whether her sacrifices had been sufficient to prevent a massacre and bring justice to those who preyed upon innocent people throughout Arizona territory. As she finalized plans for transmitting crucial intelligence to Sheriff Reyes, Catherine understood that her success or failure would determine not only her own survival, but the lives of everyone who would be present when Thomas Brennan's gang attempted their final desperate robbery. The mail-order bride who had discovered her betrothed was an outlaw, had become the key to destroying the entire criminal network that had terrorized the territory for years. The irony was not lost on her that Catherine Walsh, who had traveled west seeking the security of marriage to a respectable rancher, was about to risk everything to ensure that the criminal who had deceived her would face justice for his crimes. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or tragedy, but regardless of the outcome, Catherine knew she had finally found her true purpose in the harsh landscape of Arizona territory. Dawn in Phoenix arrived with deceptive tranquility. The desert city, awakening to what appeared to be another routine day of frontier commerce and territorial business. Catherine Walsh stood at the window of the hotel room Santos had secured for Brennan's advance team, watching early morning activities while her heart raced with knowledge of the violence about to unfold. Everything now depended on whether her intelligence had reached Sheriff Reyes in time, and whether federal marshals had positioned themselves effectively around the territorial bank. The modified robbery plan required Catherine to remain with the horses while Brennan's reduced force of 8 men executed the attack. Santos had assigned her this role ostensibly to utilize her skills with animals, but Catherine suspected he still harbored doubts about her loyalty and wanted her positioned where escape would be impossible if she proved treacherous. "Senorita," Santos said, checking his weapons with methodical precision, "today you learn whether our organization rewards loyalty or punishes betrayal. Your future depends entirely on how well you perform your assigned duties. Catherine nodded, with apparent understanding while fighting to control her expression. Mr. Santos, I've learned that survival requires complete commitment to the people who offer protection. I won't disappoint you. Brennan emerged from the hotel dressed like a prosperous cattle buyer, his appearance carefully crafted to avoid suspicion during the initial approach to the bank. His men similarly disguised themselves as various types of legitimate business customers, their weapons concealed beneath long coats despite the desert heat. Remember, Brennan addressed his team with quiet intensity. Speed and violence of action overcome superior numbers. Get inside, control the situation immediately, and load the money as quickly as possible. Anyone who hesitates or shows mercy endangers everyone. Catherine's role required her to manage the horses in the alley behind the bank, ensuring rapid escape routes remained available while maintaining visual contact with Santos's position at the telegraph office. The plan called for her to signal when the federal response began organizing, giving the robbery team advance warning about incoming law enforcement. As the criminals moved toward their target, Catherine offered a silent prayer for the innocent. People who would soon be caught in violence they had done nothing to deserve. Bank employees arriving for work, customers conducting legitimate business, passers-by on Phoenix's main street, all remained unaware that their ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become a battleground. The first indication that Catherine's intelligence had reached the right people came when she spotted federal marshals positioned on rooftops around the bank district. The lawmen were expertly concealed, invisible to anyone not specifically looking for them. But Catherine's trained eye caught movement and reflections that revealed their presence. Sheriff Gabriel Reyes appeared in the alley behind the bank, materializing from shadows with the silent approach that reflected his Comanche heritage. Catherine felt overwhelming relief at seeing his familiar figure, though she couldn't acknowledge his presence without compromising her cover. "Catherine," he said quietly, his voice pitched to carry only to her ears, "are you ready to end this?" She managed a barely perceptible nod while continuing to hold the reins of 8 horses whose riders were about to discover they had walked into a carefully prepared trap. Every instinct urged her to run toward safety, but her commitment to seeing justice done kept her in position despite the mortal danger. The robbery began exactly as planned, with Brennan's men entering the bank at precisely the predetermined time. Catherine heard Santos's signal from the telegraph office indicating successful disruption of communications, followed by the first gunshots from inside the territorial bank. But instead of the systematic execution Brennan had envisioned, chaos erupted as federal marshals revealed themselves and demanded surrender. The bank became a fortress under siege, with criminals trapped inside facing superior firepower and tactical positioning. "Federal marshals." Reyes's voice carried clearly through the morning air. "Thomas Brennan, you're surrounded. Release the hostages and surrender your weapons. This is your only chance to avoid additional bloodshed." Catherine heard Brennan's furious response from inside the bank, his voice distorted by rage and desperation. "Reyes, I should have killed you months ago when I had the chance. Come and take me if you can." The siege continued for nearly an hour, as federal marshals tightened their perimeter while negotiating for the release of innocent hostages. Catherine maintained her position with the horses, knowing that Santos would be watching for any sign of treachery from his concealed position. Across the street. The resolution came suddenly when Brennan attempted to fight his way out through the bank's rear entrance. Catherine found herself directly in the path of the desperate outlaw, whose deception had brought her across the continent to Arizona territory. For a moment, their eyes met with mutual recognition of how far their paths had diverged since that first evening at the Double Creek Ranch. "Catherine," Brennan snarled, his gun trained on her chest, "I knew you were too good to be true. Eastern schoolteachers don't adapt to frontier life as quickly as you pretended. I adapted exactly as circumstances required, Catherine replied with calm she didn't feel. "You taught me that survival in the territory requires recognizing opportunities and choosing the right allies." Brennan's expression twisted with bitter understanding. "You chose Gabriel Reyes over me. Congratulations, you picked the winning side." The final confrontation lasted only seconds. Brennan raised his weapon toward Catherine. Reyes appeared behind him with deadly silence, and justice was served with the swift finality that characterized frontier law enforcement. Thomas Brennan died in the Phoenix Alley where he had planned to celebrate his greatest robbery, his criminal empire collapsing around him like a house of cards. Santos attempted to escape during the confusion, but was captured by federal marshals who had been tracking his movements throughout the morning. The telegraph office operation failed completely, leaving the surviving criminals isolated and without communication or coordination. By noon, the entire network that had terrorized Arizona territory for years lay in ruins. 7 criminals were dead, 5 others captured alive, and the corruption that had protected their operations was exposed for prosecution by territorial authorities. Catherine found herself in the surreal position of giving testimony to federal investigators while still wearing the clothes of a criminal accomplice. The transformation from undercover agent back to respectable citizen required more than simply changing her attire. It meant reconciling the person she had become with the woman she had been before circumstances forced her to embrace deception and violence. "Miss Walsh," the lead federal marshal said as he reviewed her statement, "your cooperation in this investigation prevented what could have been a massacre. The territorial government owes you a considerable debt of gratitude." Catherine accepted his thanks while struggling to process the emotional aftermath of her experience. "Marshal Roberts, I hope the intelligence I provided will help prevent other criminal organizations from developing similar influence throughout the territory." Sheriff Reyes approached as the federal investigators concluded their questioning, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal concern. "Catherine, how are you handling everything that's happened?" The question forced her to confront feelings she had been suppressing throughout the ordeal. "I'm not entirely certain who I am anymore, Gabriel. 3 weeks ago, I was a schoolteacher from Vermont. Now I've witnessed murders, manipulated criminals, and indirectly caused a man's death. I'm not sure how to reconcile those experiences with who I thought I was." Reyes studied her face with the careful attention of someone who understood the psychological cost of violence and deception. "You're someone who found the courage to risk everything for justice when circumstances demanded it. That's not a loss of identity, it's a discovery of who you really are beneath the surface." The immediate aftermath of the Phoenix operation required Catherine to remain in territorial custody, while federal investigators completed their prosecution of surviving network members. But instead of feeling imprisoned, she found herself experiencing a freedom she had never known, the liberty that came from understanding her own capabilities and worth. Billy Harrison, whose cooperation had proven crucial to the operations success, received a commuted sentence that allowed him to rebuild his life as a legitimate citizen. His testimony against his former associates helped secure convictions that sent the surviving criminals to territorial prison for terms that would keep them from threatening innocent people for decades. "Miss Walsh," Billy said during one of their final meetings, "I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance at redemption. Most folks would have written me off as just another outlaw, but you saw something worth saving." Catherine felt genuine affection for the young man who had protected her when he could have simply followed orders. "Billy, everyone deserves the opportunity to choose a better path. You prove that people can change when they're given genuine alternatives to crime." The territorial governor personally commended Catherine for her service, offering her a position with the newly created Territorial Investigation Bureau that would formalize her role in combating organized crime throughout Arizona. The offer represented everything she had never dared to imagine: meaningful work, financial independence, and the respect of her community. But Catherine surprised everyone, including herself, by declining the position in favor of a different path that seemed more aligned with her original values and long-term goals. "Governor Martinez," she explained during their meeting, "I'm honored by your offer, but I believe my skills would be better utilized in education than law enforcement. The territory needs schools and teachers as much as it needs investigators and marshals." Instead, Catherine accepted an appointment as head teacher for the new territorial school system being established throughout Arizona. Her experience with criminal investigation had taught her that education was the most effective long-term solution to the poverty and desperation that drove many people toward crime. Sheriff Gabriel Reyes requested a transfer to oversee law enforcement in Catherine's assigned district, a decision that surprised no one who had observed their partnership during the criminal investigation. Their professional relationship had evolved into something deeper, a recognition of complementary strengths and shared commitment to building a better society in the harsh frontier environment. 6 months after the destruction of Thomas Brennan's criminal network, Catherine Walsh stood before her first class of Arizona Territory students in a one-room schoolhouse she had helped design and construct. The children represented every background and ethnicity that populated the diverse frontier community: Mexican, Comanche, Irish, German, and native-born American families who had come west seeking opportunity. "Today we begin learning about the world beyond our territorial borders," Catherine announced to her eager students. "Education is the tool that will allow you to build lives based on your own choices rather than circumstances beyond your control." Gabriel Reyes often visited the school during his patrol rounds, his presence providing security while his stories about different cultures enriched the students' understanding of their diverse community. The half-Comanche sheriff and the Eastern schoolteacher had found in each other the partnership that allowed both to contribute their unique strengths toward building a better future. The transformation of Arizona Territory continued as honest officials replaced corrupt politicians and legitimate businesses flourished without criminal interference. The success of Catherine's undercover operation had demonstrated that ordinary citizens could play crucial roles in combating organized crime when they found the courage to act according to their principles. Mrs. Elena Santos, Miguel's widow, opened a legitimate restaurant in Phoenix that became a gathering place for the diverse community that emerged after the criminal network's destruction. She credited Catherine's example with inspiring her own transformation from crime family member to respected businesswoman. "Senora Walsh," she said during one of Catherine's visits to Phoenix, "you showed us that women can choose their own destinies instead of accepting what others plan for them. That lesson changed everything for my family." Catherine's correspondence with women throughout the territory revealed that her story had inspired others to seek education, demand respect, and refuse to accept limitations imposed by conventional expectations. The mail-order bride who had discovered her betrothed was an outlaw had become a symbol of female independence and courage that resonated far beyond Arizona's borders. Billy Harrison established a horse breeding operation that supplied the territorial government with quality mounts for law enforcement and postal service. His success demonstrated that former criminals could rebuild their lives when given genuine opportunities and community support. "Miss Walsh," he wrote in a letter that reached her on the anniversary of their first meeting, "you taught me that redemption isn't something you receive, it's something you earn through every choice you make afterward. I'm still earning mine every day." As Catherine reflected on the year that had transformed her from a desperate woman seeking security through marriage into an independent educator, building a life of purpose and meaning, she understood that her greatest victory hadn't been the destruction of a criminal network or even her personal survival of deadly circumstances. Her greatest triumph was the discovery that Catherine Walsh possessed strength, intelligence, and courage that made her valuable as herself rather than as someone's wife or dependent. The frontier had demanded that she become more than she had ever imagined possible, and she had met that challenge by embracing the fierce independence that others had once rejected as unsuitable for a proper woman, the mail-order bride who had been deemed too dangerous for criminal organization and too independent for conventional marriage, had found her sanctuary not in the protection of others, but in the recognition of her own worth and capabilities. In the vast landscape of Arizona territory, Catherine Walsh had finally found the place where she belonged, not as someone seeking shelter, but as someone providing it for others who needed education, justice, and hope for a better future. Sheriff Gabriel Reyes, the half-Comanche lawman who had offered her sanctuary in her darkest hour, remained her closest ally and most trusted friend. Their partnership had evolved into love built on mutual respect and recognition of each other's strength, a foundation that promised to endure whatever challenges the frontier might bring. Together, they had proven that true sanctuary wasn't a place but a relationship between people who saw each other clearly and chose to stand together against whatever threatened the community they had built. The outlaw's intended bride and the battle-scarred sheriff had found in each other exactly what they needed to transform not only their own lives, but their entire territory into a place where justice and education could flourish side by side. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.